Sitting down and ready. I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. I appreciate all of you taking the time to be here and for this event. So, without further ado, all right. Critical race theory has woven itself into almost every facet of our society, prioritizing equity over equality. While equal opportunity and equality before the law are foundational tenets in this country, critical race theory undermines that by prioritizing equity between racial groups, which forces us to separate individuals into arbitrary classifications and immutable characteristics to give some more opportunities than others, and to push a number of false narratives, including the idea that America is a systemically racist country. Tonight, we have the immense privilege of hosting Dr. Lindsay. He is a mathematician and the co-author of the book Cynical Theories. Cynical Theories, which traces the origins of CRT from Marx to the present day and discusses how these ideas have mutated and transformed throughout history, especially the 19th century. His new book, Race Marxism, The Truth About Critical Race Theory and Praxis, is about where CRT comes from, what it believes, how it works, and what we can do about it. Unfortunately, many people in this room know full well what critical race theory is. In fact, they've lived it. And they've been working very, very hard to fight it. Many people here have witnessed the indoctrination going on in their children's schools. Their children have been taught that the founding document of this country is not the Constitution. The founding document of white supremacy in this country is the Constitution. I'm sorry, this is so confusing, even I'm messing this up.
You're great, Paul.
They have been told that white people are inherently racist, and parents have been lied to by teachers about what name and pronouns their children are using at school, because for some reason it is school policy to indoctrinate children struggling with their gender identity and to keep their parents in the dark. You may notice that we're not at Dartmouth, even though our group is called the Dartmouth Republicans. That's because these ideas that Dr. Lindsay is about to discuss have practical applications in physical manifestations. A few weeks ago, we attempted to host Andy No for an event called Extremism in America to discuss Antifa and left-wing violence. The irony was that an Antifa group at Dartmouth coordinated with an outside Antifa group to make violent threats against our event to get it shut down. I know that many of you drove for hours to be there and were turned away at the door by bureaucrats at Dartmouth who wanted to cancel our event, even though we had a strong security presence and we were ready to begin. And so I thank all of you for taking the time to be here. And tonight, I'm glad to say that we will not let the intolerant Dartmouth bureaucrats silence us. Thank you.
Hey y'all.
Hey, Jim.
Good to see everybody. I'm glad to be in New England in this snow. It's been a while. I'm actually from roughly this north, but we decided about 30 years ago never to come back, at least not in the winter. So I'm actually really glad to be here though. It's been great. Thank you to the Dartmouth Republicans. Thank you for Chloe and Griffin for having me. So you guys will know that, like Chloe said, you guys have been living with critical race theory, your children are living with critical race theory, you're dealing with the manifestations of critical race theory we're having this event in this restaurant, which is great, but we're not having it on campus because of the manifestations of critical race theory. And I'm actually kind of glad to be here. This was really good food. So, just telling the truth. I want to kind of like lay out for you guys why critical race theory is this way, but first I want everybody to feel confident that your intuitions about critical race theory so far have been correct. It's not normal. It's not the operation of this country. It is not the values of America, and it wasn't from the beginning. It was Marxist from the beginning. In fact, in the words of the people who created it, a man named Richard Delgado, who wrote a book called Critical Race Theory and Introduction in 2001, he was actually at the meeting in 1989 outside of Madison, Wisconsin, outside of the University of Wisconsin at Madison, in the convent where they cooked up critical race theory for the first time. And in that comment, a few years later, he was asked in an interview about this event in this convent, creating critical race theory. He said, we were trying to figure out if we had anything in common. We were critical legal scholars. Critical means critical Marxism, by the way. The critical theory tradition of Max Horkheimer, Herbert Marcuse, which is short for critical Marxism. If you need a source for that, Isaac Gottesman, an education theorist at Iowa State, tells us this. He says that they got together to see if they had anything in common, any activities that they could get behind. And then he's describing this scene to the interviewer, and he says, you know, it was in a convent off campus. There's stained glass and crucifixes here and there around the room. It was an odd setting for a bunch of Marxists. That's what he says about it. So the birth of critical race theory was in Marxist theory. So what I want to actually kind of spend some time doing is telling you how this happened. Because a lot of people will, if you've studied Marxism, I know we're near Dartmouth. I know there's not a lot of Dartmouth students here, but a lot of people who have studied Marxism will realize it's supposed to be an economic theory. It's really a religion posing as an economic theory, or maybe even a entitlement complex posing as an economic theory. But how do you get from workers of the world unite and all the propaganda the communists put forth through the middle part of the 20th century saying that the West was racist, pointing to segregation in the United States and saying, look how racist the United States is. We don't have racism and communism. Workers are workers. Workers of the world unite. How do you get from that to a blatantly race-conscious ideology? And then how dare I have the chutzpah to say, you're not supposed to say it the way, chutzpah. How dare I have the stones to say that this is Marxism using race in place of class, when obviously this is a class-based theory in the first place. And that's the story I want to tell you, and it's a story of critical theory, the critical Marxist theory. We could start all the way back at Marx. We could talk about the goal of Marxism according to Marx, writing in the Communist Manifesto, which he wrote in December of 1847, published in early 1848 with Friedrich Engels. He says in there in the second chapter that communism can be summarized in a single sentence, which is the abolition of private property. Turns out that's not a sentence, but maybe it was in German, I don't know. He says that the goal is to abolish, in fact, not all property, but bourgeois property. And he has this whole theory about the bourgeoisie as a superstructure of society that organizes society for its own benefit, and it oppresses and exploits and alienates the working class, which does all the productive labor, as an infrastructure for society that produces it. Later theorists will talk about this, said that this superstructure is in a relationship called a dialectical relationship with the infrastructure, and as such, they produce a structure for society. The infrastructure the infrastructure works against the superstructure. This creates a structure of society that determines, through a theory called material determinism, who you are as a person depending on which economic class you are in. The goal of Marxism is therefore to raise a class consciousness of your position within this hierarchy, and what this structure is made out of is what Marx referred to as social relations. So the social relations of society determine your character, they determine who you are, they determine your experience in life, and what you might be able to think or do or whatever else. And in particular, your alienation from the productive efforts of your own work, which are being stolen by the superstructural ideologists who have created these things called ideologies in order to justify their dominance. Why they get to hold property, why they get to own factories, why they get to be lawyers to mediate legal disputes for people, why we need priests and pastors to minister religion, the opiate of the masses, as he put it in his critique of Hegel's philosophy of the right in 1844. They create these mythologies called ideologies that justify their superior position in society. And the goal is to awaken every single person in society, whether they're in that bourgeois position, to realize that they are enthralled to this ideology and therefore harming the working class and the rest of society, or to awaken the working class to realize that they are being exploited and alienated from themselves, from the product of their labor, from one another, from the very spiritual renewal that comes through productive work. And to get the people in that proletariat, that working class, to band together in this consciousness and decide to overthrow this exploitative system. And he thought this would happen spontaneously. Marx thought that the contradictions of capitalism, for example, that we generate all this wealth, but there's still poor people. That's a contradiction, as he would have it. Would eventually become so intolerable that the working class would spontaneously organize. They would start to engage in massive labor activism, and the next thing you know, these labor movements would band together and form a dictatorship of the proletariat, seize the means of production, and rule over and administer a equitable economy, as we might use the modern parlance, a socialist economy, where shares are distributed as Marx had it, how's it go? Each according to his ability, giving each according to his ability, taking each according to his need, in a perversion of the gospel that he wrote. And so, what you can take away from that is the idea that equity, in fact, the administered economy of equal outcomes in one domain or another, is socialism. So what that means is that equity is the updated word that means socialism. It is a trick for us to think that it means anything else. So equity means socialism, and so when you see that we're going to center equity in everything that we do, what that means is we're going to center an administered economy that's going to redistribute shares so that things are made equal on the outside or on the other side, which means that we're going to have socialism. What Marx believed is that if we administer this long enough, it will become spontaneous. We won't need a state any longer to administer equitable outcomes, because people will come to need equitable outcomes. People's consciousness will be raised by living in a condition of equitable outcomes to realize that we are truly a social species. We are truly not just man, but socialist man. And man will be remade. Human nature will be remade by getting to live in this forced, equitable condition for long enough, and then the state, he said, will wither away. Economic classes will have already been abolished through the equity of socialism, and then what we will achieve is a truly just society called communism, stateless and classless. And maybe you'll hunt in the morning, and you'll fish in the afternoon, and you'll do criticism in the evening, but you never have to become a hunter, a fisherman, or a critic. You never have to commit to anything. You can do whatever you want, whenever you want, because we'll live in this perfect, just society on the far end. This is actually Marx's theory. You can tell this is crackpot. This isn't going to work. And it's going to be achieved again through a dictatorship of the proletariat that enforces this on people. Well, this never happened. This never happened. And the Marxists of the early 20th century, 1910s and 1920s, noticed. Certainly Lenin picked up these ideas, and his Bolshevik revolution took place in 1917 in Russia, whether we liked it or not. I know we have some Ukrainians here. The Holodomor wasn't such a great thing. 9 million Ukrainians were, according to Walter Duranty, hungry but not starving. He won a Pulitzer for that. The New York Times still holds that Pulitzer, by the way. They have never disclaimed the Pulitzer for covering up the murder of 9 million Ukrainians. The New York Times is still proud to hold that Pulitzer Prize, just like their 1619 Pulitzer Prize that they just got. So Lenin picks this up, does mass murder on a scale unimaginable in the world before the so-called Russian Revolution, destroys Russia, brings it into the USSR, absolute calamity, absolute catastrophe, possibly over 40 million dead through the 70 or so years, 69 years, it turns out that the Soviet Union existed. Possibly, like I said, as many as 40 million people killed in this bid to get to a stateless, classless society that doesn't work, to try to enforce Marxist theory into practice. But here's the problem. Russia was a peasant society. It was not an advanced capitalist center in 1917 when Lenin charged in and at the barrel of a gun and at the end of a bayonet installed equity. Marxist theory said the society, history, that the entire trajectory of human social relations from one epoch to the next will progress along a scientific course. It will start with equitable tribal economies that if you're in the tribe, everybody shares. Nobody owns anything. You have primitive communism, he said, and that's stage one of history. But eventually what's going to happen is some tribes are going to realize that they can dominate over others. They can claim that this land is theirs and that land is yours, and we're going to take your land, and they will enslave the people that they conquer. And we enter into a slave economy. That's the second stage of history according to Marx, which he said goes in 6 stages. The third stage is this aristocracy, this feudal peasant society that Russia found itself in 1917. And then eventually, these aristocrats who own all the land and employ serfs to do all the work, kind of like slavery one step removed. What would happen with these people is that they would claim the right to their own property. Capitalism would evolve, and when you have capitalism, everybody has the right to own their own property. They have the right to, in fact, life, liberty, and property, as John Locke put it. That's where the true seeds of freedom will be. Of course, Marx wasn't a big fan of that, especially the property part, but the life and liberty part didn't go so well either. Gulags for re-education is a bit of a restriction of your liberty, and being shot if you don't like this circumstance is a bit of a restriction of your right to life. But he said that capitalism is going to come about, and it's going to advance, and it's going to get industrial, and it's going to reach a high level of production and a high level, therefore, of contradiction that will then create these spontaneous workers' movements. And so you will see communism or socialism spontaneously erupt in these industrial centers: Berlin, Paris, London, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles. Not St. Petersburg. Not backwards China, a couple of decades later. So the Marxists of the early 20th century were like, something's wrong. Marx was not right. You had the communists, for example, Antonio Gramsci in Italy. He was very upset that the workers' parties in Italy wouldn't spontaneously organize to a high level. They wouldn't do it. They wouldn't take the step. In fact, what the cultural Marxists that arose in the early part of the 20th century and the neo-Marxists that grew out of them as the 20th century wore on into World War II, what they noticed was that what you have are these kind of labor movements start up, and all the workers want are tolerable conditions. They just actually want to end exploitation. They don't want to have some crackpot religion where everybody's made equal. They want to go to work, earn an honest wage for the effort that they put in, and be able to buy some stuff that they like. That's all they want. And they wrestled with this. They're like, Marx was wrong about where socialism would take root, and then Marx was also wrong about how the working class works. The working class, it turns out, agitates for reforms, and when it gets them, they stop being revolutionary. In fact, they're never revolutionary. They just want some reforms. They just don't want to be mistreated. Kind of like we see with the truckers in Ottawa. They just don't want to be mistreated. By the way, that's class consciousness, if you ever wondered what it actually looks like in reality. MAGA was class consciousness, if you ever wonder what it actually looks like in reality. And it doesn't want equity. It wants freedom. Marx was wrong about that too. But these critical Marxists through the middle part of the 20th century had to solve this riddle. They had to solve this riddle, and so they decided that what was going on is that the working class was the wrong basis for revolution. The working class, in fact, is not, Marx was wrong, it's not where you're going to find a basis for a full-scale revolt to cause a revolution in society. So they're looking around the world and who's succeeding at communist revolutions in the 1960s while they're trying to piece these things together. Well, Mao Zedong is. The CCP was successful at their revolution in 1949. Mao got chased out of power after the Great Leap Forward was an absolute catastrophe. And then he sweeps back in 1966 and begins a cultural revolution. And this is in line with these theories from people like Antonio Gramsci, who I noted a little bit ago. Gramsci said if you want to overthrow a capitalist society, you've got to overthrow its culture from within. it has this force field called hegemony, which is how power really works. And you have to get inside the cultural institutions that produce hegemony, that transfer culture from one generation to the next. You have to get inside of those. And if you get inside of those and you subvert them from within, you flip them over from within and make them communist on the inside, then you can prepare the ground for a cultural revolution. And the saying in the broad literature is that Mao Zedong did what Gramsci thought. It's not likely that Mao read Gramsci, it's possible. But at any rate, the same ideas were matriculating through the Comintern, the third International Communist Party. Certainly Gramsci's writings had been smuggled to Moscow after he died in 1937 in a fascist prison in Italy. Certainly they were known in China before the 1940s, and certainly Mao put into effect a cultural revolution that was going to tear things apart from within. Gramsci said you have to take apart the 5 key cultural pillars of a society if you want to make it communist. Those are religion, family, education, media, and law. I would certainly add healthcare to that in our modern society. Education is by far the most important of those. And they realized this in the 1960s. They also realized some other things. So they're staring at this problem. As Herbert Marcuse put it, capitalism, advanced capitalism delivers the goods. As Max Horkheimer, one of the founder of critical theory, as a matter of fact, the guy who coined the term critical theory in 1937, he said, you know, capitalism, when it becomes advanced, allows the working class to build a better life. Herbert Marcuse said this life delivers the goods. It's a good life. It's just not a utopian life. It's not a perfect life. And so it steals the revolutionary consciousness from the working class, so the working class sucks. That's why the Marxists of today hate the working class. And what did Marcuse say we have to do? We have to find that vital energy for a revolution somewhere else. And he said, I know where, and in his own words, the ghetto population. He said, well, let's look at what's going on with the Black Liberation Army. Let's look at what's going on with Black power and Black nationalism. Let's look at the sexual minorities. Let's look at the feminists. They have the right energy. And of course, who welcomed these stupid Marxists over from the Institute of Marxism, which got renamed the Institute for Social Research so that wouldn't be too on the nose, also known as the Frankfurt School? Who welcomed them over when Hitler claimed the chancellorship in 1933? Columbia University. The universities in the United States welcomed them over. The academic left was going to be born. So Herbert Marcuse said, all we have to do is take these students that were radicalizing the student movement, and we'll attach those to the identity politics movements that have all the vital energy. So if we can get a bunch of students, college students, to become communists here at Columbia or UCLA, where he went later, he was at Brandeis. A lot of these Ivy League schools hosted these people at one point or another. If we get these college students to basically deliver theory into the ghetto population, if we can get them to deliver it to the feminists, if we can get them to deliver it to the sexual minorities through sexual liberation ideas, then we can find a new working class, he said. And that new working class will not be able to be stabilized. It will be truly revolutionary, and that revolution can be perpetual. And we can then move on, as he phrased it at the beginning of his 1969 essay, which is called An Essay on Liberation, to a biological foundation for socialism, where we will introject a new morality into people until they cannot live outside of a socialist system. This was the objective then. And Herbert Marcuse radicalized, for example, Angela Davis, a black feminist and terrorist and member of the Communist Party. Radicalized Angela Davis, and the black feminism movement that actually arose out of this was the birthplace of intersectionality. It was the birthplace actually of the same thoughts that led to critical race theory and to queer theory. That was more the feminists actually than the black feminists specifically. But this solidarity across all forms of oppression, to see all forms of oppression as co-mingled with one another, that you can't reduce from one to the other, but you can only choose which one you center, became the new way of thinking about Marxist theory, with that full-blown resentment of the working class. If you don't come to understand that Marxism changed its mind to full-blown resentment of the working class in the 1960s because they stabilized, because capitalism actually worked for them, then you cannot understand how Marxism evolved through the late part of the 20th century, and you cannot understand where critical race theory came from today, or queer theory, or disability studies, or fat studies, or post-colonial theory, or any of them, which are actually all multiple facets of the exact same idea, which is Marxism. In fact, it's the Leninist brand of Marxism. These elites in the universities, or lovely professors, are the new vanguard. They're the new elites who are going to tell us how it is that everybody has to think. And the intellectual class is going to usher us through into a state of equity, an administered economy where everybody gets equal. And eventually, if we interject this morality in Herbert Marcuse's language long enough, then it will become spontaneous. And the way that the critical race theorists phrase that is that in the long end, we will end up with racial justice. So you see the same historical trajectory in critical race theory then that you see in Marxism. Marxism had those 6 stages. Just to summarize again, primitive communism leads to slavery, slavery leads to aristocracy, aristocracy leads to capitalism and freedom. This is loaded with contradictions. Eventually, class consciousness arises within those intolerable conditions from the contradictions. Class consciousness leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat that seizes the means of production, enforces equal outcomes called socialism. This 5th stage of history progresses eventually to spontaneity, and we enter into the utopia of communism. If you want this in religious language, what you have actually is eventually you have this thing called a revolution that is equivalent to the rapture. We enter into an uncomfortable stage called tribulation, aka socialism, and on the other side we enter back into the garden or the kingdom of God arrives on earth, and we're in communism, in the utopia, if you want that in religious language. What do we see in critical race theory? In the beginning you have tribes, doesn't matter what you look like, if the tribe lets you in through the rituals, if you're a member of the tribe, you're as equal with everybody else. Eventually some tribes not only figure out that they can enslave one another over property or whatever else, but based on race. And we end up with chattel slavery, particularly in the British Empire, but not only. The European empires all kind of practice this in various ways based on race. Eventually we realize slavery is a moral abomination. We abolish slavery and we enter into an apartheid state, a racial aristocracy where there's a racial upper caste and a racial lower caste. Jim Crow laws in the United States are what upheld that. Apartheid in South Africa is another example. The segregation, separate but equal, etc., lays out what that looks like. And eventually we have a civil rights movement where somebody like Martin Luther King stands up and says that there's a promissory note written in the liberal documents that founded this country, written to every single individual in this country regardless of their color or their skin, that we're going to be as people who are created equal with certain inalienable rights, and it's time to live up to that. And so we have this civil rights movement, and we enter into a phase, as Martin Luther King himself laid it out, that will be colorblind equality. Colorblind equality is what he lays out. How do you know it's colorblind? He says we're going to judge people on the contents of their character rather than the color of their skin. It will be colorblind. We're going to say, who are you as a person? We're not going to look at your skin color. This colorblind equality is tantamount to the freedom of capitalism in economic theory. Eventually, though, there are going to be contradictions. Supposedly, according to critical race theory, we have colorblind equality, but look at all the racial inequity that we have. We have racial disparities by group. Outcomes are not equal. That's a contradiction. So who is going to rise up and seize the means of, say, both cultural and material production in this new world? The anti-racists are. And we will have a dictatorship of the anti-racists that enforces equity as a 5th stage of racial history that will eventually become spontaneous, leading us to the long end of this racial justice, which is communism, using race as the central concept instead of class. You can go back to, say, Gloria Ladson-Billings, a critical race theorist and education theorist, from 1995 in her paper Toward a Critical Race Theory of Education, because it's not in schools. They just wrote that in 1995, just for the heck of it. Richard Delgado, who I mentioned earlier, wrote that 2001 book, Critical Race Theory Introduction, on the high school level, and it includes classroom exercises at the end of every chapter, because it's not in schools. In the second paragraph of that book, he explains that it rapidly spread out of law into other disciplines, most notably education, because it's not in schools. If you haven't figured it out, a synonym for critical race theorist is liar. Agenda-driven liar. Their agenda install critical race theory everywhere. And what do we see, though? What did Gloria Ladson-Billings tell us? She says that critical race theory exists to make race the central concept for understanding inequality. That's her own words. So we're going to take economic class out as the central concept for understanding inequality. We're going to put race in as the central concept for understanding inequality. Because it's a Marxist theory, created by Marxists, for Marxists, to achieve a Marxist revolution, using a new working class, just like Herbert Marcuse, the leading Marxist of the 1960s, and really probably the late 20th century, as he put it. We need a new working class. We'll find it in the ghetto population. 20 years later, we have critical race theory to do exactly that. And it completely throws out the entire liberal order and tries to replace it with a dictatorship of the anti-racists. Let me read to you from St. Ibram X. Kendi on this point. In case you think I overstate the idea of a dictatorship of the anti-racists, let me actually read to you. Now, Kendi's famous for his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, which on page 19 he says the only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination, and the only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination, in case you wonder what critical race theory is about. Delgado tells us in his book that color blindness, in fact, reproduces inequality, so we have to get rid of that. How? By discriminating. We need a discriminating tolerance. In fact, Herbert Marcuse told us in his essay Repressive Tolerance from 1965. But what does Kendi tell us in 2019, the same year that How to Be an Anti-Racist came out? He got asked by Politico magazine, how do you fix inequality? And he says, pass an anti-racist constitutional amendment. Now, the Constitution is the highest law of the land. The Constitution fully amended is the law by which all other law has to be judged. So he wants this enshrined into every aspect of law in the United States. What does he tell us? To fix the original sin of racism, Americans should pass an anti-racist amendment to the U.S. Constitution that enshrines two guiding anti-racist principles. And he misspelled principles. And he got like a 1,000 on his SAT, give him a break. True story, it's in the book. Principle 1, racial inequity is evidence of racist policy. In Principle 2, the different racial groups are equals. Not very many people have a problem with the second of these two guiding principles, but that first one tells you the answer to a question every time. If you see racial inequity, differences in outcome on average by racial group, it will be interpreted as evidence of racist policy. If outcomes come out differently, we know the explanation, it's racism. Why? Because the Constitution says so. He says the amendment would make unconstitutional racial inequity over a certain threshold, as well as racist ideas by public officials. So now this, whichever number it would be, 28 or 29 or whatever you would end up getting, amendment will be in direct contradiction to the First Amendment, which says that you can't make ideas unconstitutional. It would establish, he tells us, and permanently fund the Department of Anti-Racism, DOA. The jokes write themselves. Comprised of formally trained experts on racism and no political appointees. In other words, critical race theorists are going to be the people who get to decide what is racist and what is not. And what's the purview of this DOA? The DOA would be responsible for pre-clearing all local, state, and federal public policies to ensure they won't yield racial inequity. So policy at every level, local, state, and federal, is going to be subject to the formally trained experts on racism to determine if they are okay or not. Every policy has to be pre-cleared by this department, this new fourth branch of government. It will also monitor those policies, investigate private racist policies wherever racial inequity surfaces, and monitor public officials for expressions of racist ideas. The DOA would be empowered with disciplinary tools to wield over and against policymakers and public officials who do not voluntarily change their racist policies and ideas. So DOA stands for Dictatorship of the Anti-Racists. That is a dictatorship. Not only does it have absolute authority over federal, state, and local policy, but also over private corporate policy, private individual policy, and it will monitor so-called public officials, whatever that means, for expressions of racist ideas. And if those ever come up, it will be empowered to punish people, maybe with re-education in a gulag, or through social credit, or who knows what, in order to make sure that they change their racist policies and ideas. This is a dictatorship of the anti-racists. This is a perfect parallel to the dictatorship of the proletariat, and its goal is explicitly to create an enforced state of outcomes called racial equity, socialism. Now, you may have remembered that after George Floyd died, eventually there was a trial, and Derek Chauvin was convicted on 3 counts for what happened that day. And then within 10 minutes, you had Democratic political leaders like Bernie Sanders and AOC and half of the squad coming out on television and on social media saying this was not justice. This was accountability. We have a lot of work to do before we get to justice. Why? Because what they mean by justice is not justice. What they mean by justice is that racial equity becomes spontaneous. And so I confirm my earlier claim that justice, in the sense of social justice, as the extension of social equity, which is what's actually meant by equity, is the new brand name for communism. So when I say that critical race theory is race Marxism, I fully mean it. It was created by Marxists. It uses Marxist theory. It uses Marxist historicism to describe how things are going to go, although updated through neo-Marxist theory, where if you don't get communism, you land in fascism, one or the other. That's one of their big updates. And it decenters and in fact hates the working class and replaces it with an elite vanguard primarily of academic professors, but also media personalities, government officials, and corporate leaders that are willing to buy in. So you say it can't be Marxism if all the corporations are involved in it. No. Neo-Marxists realized that the working class was the problem. Marxism in the 1960s and early 1970s, right beneath all of our noses, changed. And it abandoned the working class, in fact, gained contempt for the working class for failing them, and shifted into what's known, according again to Isaac Gottesman, who I referenced earlier, into what's known as the academic left. The working class was abandoned completely. These academic theories and subjects like law and media and education are now going to be the new direction for the party. And critical race theory was born in exactly those conditions. So what is critical race theory? I'll read again, and not from Kendi this time, I'll read from Delgado. I don't like to misrepresent arguments, so I'll read to you what is critical race theory from a critical race theorist, so that I don't have to tell you what I want to tell you. A good definition for me for critical race theory is, and I put this in my new book, in Race Marxism, right at it's the first thing I put in there, is that critical race theory is a noun, and it means calling everything you want to control racist until you control it. That's all it means. So if you get called racist by a critical race theorist, all it means is they want to control you. So Joe Rogan is racist now. Why? Because they want to control him. The thing in Ottawa is racist now. Why? Because they want to control it. Racism is a public health threat now. Why? Because they want to control medicine at all levels. Your kid's school is racist and it doesn't teach honest history, it teaches whitewashed history. Why? Because they want to control it. It's that simple. But I'll give you something from them rather than this characterization. Another more fair definition I give, by the way, is that critical race theory is the belief that the organizing principle of society is racism that benefits white people. And that's as good of a definition as you actually need. It's actually structural racism is the fundamental organizing principle of society, which is racism that was created by white people for white people's own benefit. And if I read to you, and I don't have this one open, so I can't do it as quickly and easily, if I read to you the definition that critical race theorists give for race, you'd be appalled and you would see that I'm correct. But maybe I'll go looking for it. I have it somewhere. But Richard Delgado tells us, page 2 of Critical Race Theory and Introduction, section A. This is in chapter 1. What is critical race theory? That's the title of the section. He says the critical race theory movement is a collection of activists and scholars interested in studying and transforming the relationship among race, racism, and power. It already sounds a little Marxist. But notice that activists come first. It is a collection of activists. Activism and scholarship, by the way, are in intrinsic tension. Activism requires you to think you know the answer. Scholarship requires you to not know the answer so that you can investigate. They are in intrinsic tension with one another. So scholar is being misused here. These are pretentious people pretending to be scholars. The movement, it says, considers many of the same issues that conventional civil rights and ethnic studies discourses takes up, but that but indicates that conventional civil rights is not what they're interested in, but places them in a broader perspective that includes economics, history, context, group and self-interest, and even feelings in the unconscious, because it can read your mind. And of course, what it reads there is racism. If it wants to control you, whatever your motivations were, they were the worst possible motivations you could have had. unlike, as if they didn't drive the nail in civil rights as it were, unlike traditional civil rights, which embraces incrementalism and step-by-step progress, what does that leave on the table, folks? Revolution. It's in their own words. Critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order. So all you conservatives that keep calling these people liberals, stop it. They're leftists. They are not liberals. Most of the conservatives in this room are actually liberals. They believe in the Constitution. Critical race theory calls into question the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory. Sorry, Martin. Meaning Luther King. Sorry, Martin. No equality theory. No legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and the neutral principles of constitutional law. So the rule of law, out. Neutrality, out. Constitution, out. Rationalism, out. Equality, out. You can't have equality in critical race theory because they believe in structural determinism. That's where I said we would come back to this. The infrastructure and the superstructure. What are they? The superstructure is the ideology-producing sector of society. That's white supremacists. They have access to whiteness, which is bourgeois property, which according to Karl Marx must be abolished, which is why Robin DiAngelo tells us the objective is to recognize that there's no such thing as a positive white identity, and her goal is to become less white. You must abolish whiteness, which is to abolish private property. Critical race theory can be summarized in a single sentence. It is not a sentence, to paraphrase Karl Marx. The abolition of whiteness. Whiteness is bourgeois racial property in this model. And what are we going to do? We're going to look at, what are they going to do? What are they going to do? They're going to look at this racial superstructure, the whites who have access to whiteness, the white adjacents, that's Asian people and most Latinos, especially if they don't go along with the critical race theory line. Some blacks who are acting white, like President Obama, they wrote a whole book about that. Said that he had to act white in order to be president because of the white supremacist structure of society. And then they are going to exploit the racial underclass, the people of color. A good example that they often give of this is that the blues came out of black communities, and then the white guy, Elvis Presley, stole the blues, turned it into rock and roll, and profited, and everybody forgot the blacks that wrote the blues, and they could go on playing their blues even sadder because they had their cultural property appropriated. Cultural appropriation, anybody? Racial exploitation. It's exactly Marxian exploitation and alienation from your own cultural product. It's just a reproduction of Marxism in new words. So the racial superstructure and the racial infrastructure are therefore in a dialectical relationship that creates a structure of society. That structure determines your character. So Martin Luther King was naive when he said, we'll judge by the contents of character, because as Kimberly Crenshaw said, that wouldn't recognize, and she does not invoke Martin Luther King when she says this, don't let me mislead you. She says that what everybody in the liberal and postmodern traditions miss is that race is imposed by the structure of society. And the imposition of race makes it such that you can't just judge by the content of character, because the content of your character is structurally determined by the racial superstructure interacting with the racial infrastructure, creating a structural racism that is the fundamental organizing principle of society, as I said. Kimberly Crenshaw, in this same paper, which is called Mapping the Margins, written in 1991, tells us, in fact, to explicitly reject Martin Luther King's vision. What does she say? She says that there's a fundamental difference between I am black and I'm a person who happens to be black. She says, I'm a person who happens to be black strains is her exact word, for a certain universality. In effect, I am first a person. And she thinks that's bad. Meanwhile, I am black, she says, becomes an anchor for subjectivity in the sight of a meaningful politic of identity. Now, if you know anything about Marxism on a deep level, you know that anchor for subjectivity means Marxism. Because that's what Marx was talking about. That's what class consciousness is. This is a recognition of you as a person are a subject. And as a subject, you have a vision for what you want to see in the world. You bring that to being in the world as an object outside of yourself, and you see yourself in the object you created, thus reproducing Hegel's dialectic between the subjective and the objective, but now in the material sense. And that's the point of doing the work, as they say. The work is productive work, through which the subject brings his being into existence in the objective world and comes to know himself in an act of spiritual renewal. And when we all have the same subjective vision in our mind, we are truly social man or socialist man. And man and society become co-continuous, and that's when you're actually going to see the dissolution of the the state and of the classes, and you'll have your communist utopia, when all men have absolutely submitted themselves to the fact of their social nature, in which case they all live for one another. Just to really drive a nail in this, though, let's read paragraph 2 from this book. Although critical race theory began as a movement in the law, I told you this was coming, it has rapidly spread beyond that discipline. Today, this is in 2001, in a book written for high schoolers, many in the field of education consider themselves critical race theorists who use critical race theory's ideas to understand issues of school discipline and hierarchy, tracking controversies over curriculum and history, and IQ and achievement testing. That's why they're getting rid of the SAT. That's why they're getting rid of advanced placement classes for equity. That's why they're saying that the lowest grade anybody can get in some schools is a 40 or an 80 for equity. That's why they're moving to what they call project-based learning, where everything's done in groups. And, you know, we all know how that goes. We all know how group work actually goes. One person does all the work, and 3 or 4 people mooch along, just like Karl Marx. He was a moocher. If you don't know he's a moocher, he was a moocher. Drained everybody around him, especially Engels, especially his mom, especially his wife's family for money. Never earned a dime himself, refused to. These guys go on to tell us political scientists ponder voting strategies coined by critical race theorists. You didn't know Stacey Abrams was going to be in this book, but here she is. Ethnic studies courses often include a unit on critical race theory, and American studies departments teach material on critical white studies developed by CRT writers. This is another place you've been gaslit. They tell you when you bring up the critical whiteness studies, like Robin DiAngelo, they say that's not critical race theory, that's critical whiteness studies. It's not part of it. Well, yes it is. They say so in their own words in the second paragraph of this book. But this is the money shot here. Unlike some academic disciplines, critical race theory contains an activist dimension. It not only tries to understand our social situation, but to change it. And that's a direct paraphrasing of Karl Marx. Hitherto, philosophers have sought to understand the world. The point is to change it. How? Through ruthless criticism of all that exists. And when it gets bad enough, violence will be the midwife of the revolution. Those are all Karl Marx's statements. Critical race theory reproduces this, as Gloria Ladson-Billings told us, centering race in place of class. It makes race the central construct for understanding inequality. If that doesn't drive the point home enough, Charles Mills, who recently died as a critical philosopher of race, I'm told by critical race theorists that I can't invoke him as a critical race theorist because that's somehow different. Technically, he called himself an analytic philosopher instead of a continental philosopher, and that's supposed to be the difference. But Charles Mills, first of all, wrote a book in 1997 called The Racial Contract that reproduces Rousseau's social contract theory and says that all white people have created a racial contract. It's a gigantic conspiracy theory is what it is. Have created a racial contract that they never tell anybody about, what they all participate in, to keep white people up and all other races down unless they want to sell out in one way or another by being a model minority, by gaining white adjacency, by acting white, or whatever else. Well, Charles Mills wrote a book later in the early 2000s, and I forget the exact year, I think it was 2003, called From Class to Race, explaining how he abandoned traditional Marxism through his own critiques of Marxism and arrived at critical race theory as the new Marxism that he was going to espouse. If you need it any more certainly, I don't know how to give it to you. So what we have then is that critical race theory is a reproduction of Marxism, and now you have to ask yourself, why are they installing this so vigorously in the schools? How are they installing it so vigorously in our schools? Why is it all over the place? Well, that's what Marxists do, first of all, but the reason is because they know that they have to change the younger generation. Marxism works by saying that you have to use the younger generation to clear the field. Marx argued this explicitly. You have to clear the field of the previous culture so that the new culture with new man can take its place. So you have to reach the new generation. And it turns out that what's going on in our schools isn't just critical race theory. As a matter of fact, critical race theory is kind of low on the pole in terms of how bad things are going on in the schools. Above it somewhere is queer theory, and above that is social emotional learning, which they're using to implement both. And this program reproduces a famous communist's program in the schools in 1966 almost perfectly. It's Mao Zedong, where he's creating the Red Guard. The way that Mao Zedong created the Red Guard was very simple. He named 5 categories of people in society as black. Those were bad. We'll bring critical race theory onto that at some point later. And then there were the 5 red categories for communists that were good. So the black categories in society were things like landlord, wealthy farmer, counter-revolutionary, bad influences, which basically is a carte blanche to anybody he doesn't like. The red categories in society were laborers, peasants, revolutionaries, and people in the Red Guard, for example. You had 5 of each. It's hard for me to remember more than 4 for some reason of each one. You're just going to have to deal with it. Look it up yourself. It's on Wikipedia. Which means it's totally true. What he did, though, was he would take children in the schools and say you were the son of a landowner or a landlord or a wealthy farmer. He would label the child with a black identity and say if you become a Red Guard, if you become a revolutionary, you can have a red identity. All you have to do is rebel against your family. All you have to do is rebel against the 4 olds: old culture, old customs, old habits, old ways of thinking, habits of mind. All you have to do is show up to the temples and rip the art out of them and destroy it. All you have to do is go find people practicing traditional Chinese medicine and beat them to death. All you have to do is go beat up your parents for their old ideas. And on it goes. Tens of millions died in this little project. And China, or Mao, I guess, seized total power, created calamity. No one knows how many people died in the Cultural Revolution. Tens of millions is the standard estimate. It's not known, it may be as many as 100 million died. Probably isn't quite that many, it's probably just 70 million. You know, what's 30 million people here or there when you're talking about mass murder? And the way he did this was by mobilizing the students primarily, both teenagers and college students, by giving them these different identity categories. So what do you see with critical race theory and queer theory and fat studies and disability studies and so on? You're straight, white, male. Uh-oh, black identities. Those are bad. What can you do? You can become an ally. You could be bisexual. Why don't you transition? We'll give you a way out of your boring, bad, problematic, power-reproducing identity. There's no such thing as a positive white identity, Robin DiAngelo tells us. You must strive to be less white. But what can you do? You can become an ally. That's a red identity. You can transition. And why? Why these things? Especially the sexual things. So you beat these poor kids over the head with their race, model minority. You're acting white, whatever it happens to be. You can adopt a politicized revolutionary identity over here and, do whatever it is you want to do as a revolutionary to tear our society down. Or you can transition. Why the focus on the queer theoretic identities? Why are they pushing gender theory so hard in parallel to critical race theory? Why are they pushing queer theory so hard? The point of queer theory, by the way, is not to support LGBTQ equality. As a matter of fact, Hannah Dyer, an award-winning queer theorist, tells us explicitly in a paper about queer futurity that queer theory exists to not stabilize LGBTQ identities. Because if they're stable, that's a problem. It exists, in fact, to give children identities without an essence, so that they have permanent identity disorders. They live in constant anxiety, social anxiety about who they are and how they can relate to one another. How you give them pronouns, you tell them that their gender might change from day to day. Nobody knows what to do, nobody knows what they can say without offending somebody or hurting them. But then what else does this achieve? They go home and they tell their parents that they are a demisexual lithromantic, and that their gender is trigender, and that their pronouns are tree self. And dad's like, what? That's not real. And they say, you don't understand me. And then maybe they pull out the Bible and they say, no, the Bible says that God created us male and female. And they say, Christianity's not for me, it doesn't understand me. It's outdated. And you say, that's not how we do things in this country. And they say, the United States sucks. It doesn't understand me. It plays into the narcissism of adolescence to get them to reject their parents, their faith, and the previous culture, the 4 olds, if you will. Just like Mao. And the way that they inject this identity Marxist poison into your children through all the different, whatever it is, disability studies, they all have to have mental illnesses now. If you don't have anxiety, you're not cool. That's real, that's a thing. You have to have an eating disorder if you're a girl, or you're not like really dealing with your body dysmorphia. Everybody has to have it. The way they inject this poison is through a psychological program called social and emotional learning, where they break people down psychologically and tell them what the correct social and emotional responses to various circumstances are. They get them to engage in survey taking, 12 years old. This is in the state of North Carolina. This is real. You can look up Sloan Rathmush if you want to. She's done some excellent work on this. Actual surveys given to 7th grade, 12-year-old girls, asking them to describe the changes that their bodies are going through and how it makes them feel. Explicitly ask them to describe the changes happening to their breasts and how boys are looking at them differently. To talk about the growth of their pubic hair and how that makes them feel. And then these things get read out in class in front of everybody. And they're told how to feel about that on the other side. You have to be affirming. You have to be celebratory. You have to engage in belonging. Belonging means not just that you don't offend anybody, but you positively make them feel like they belong by affirming and celebrating whatever they're given. So I just recently traveled to the state of Kansas and talked to several groups and parents there, and we have a problem. One of these parents was telling me, very fascinating problem, where her daughter, she took her out of the one school because it was indoctrinating her in this way. They put her in a new school, and then you got this one kid who's going through all this kind of stuff with her gender, sexual, whatever, demi-romantic or whatever the hell she is. And so the girl that had changed schools starts affirming all of that, celebrating all that. Well, her parents are having a hard time with it and trying to get her to stop it. And so they call the other parents and say, will you tell your daughter to stop affirming my daughter's attempted mental illness? But that's the point, is to induce mental illnesses. If we read Herbert Marcuse from 1969 in the Essay on Liberation, he says we need a biological foundation for socialism. Then he has a footnote. What's a footnote say? He says, well, I don't mean real biology. I mean the level of vital needs. What does that mean? It means that critical theory was designed, whether critical race theory, critical gender theory, queer theory, whatever, to induce mental illness. The inability to function on a day-to-day basis in the existing society. Why? Because the mentally ill are never stabilized. And they are perfect little revolutionaries. And that's exactly what they're using social and emotional learning to do to your children, using identity theories like critical race theory, critical gender theory, queer theory, etc., to do it. In fact, openly celebrating under the banner of disability studies the idea of mental illness as an identity factor. This is why they're doing it. It's very simple. Why are they pushing these books that contain literal pornography? Like genderqueer. Have you read genderqueer? You should look genderqueer up. I got a video demonetized on YouTube just for actually quoting what's in the book genderqueer. Specifically where it says for one young man to give another a blowjob with that word. This is in children's libraries and schools and public schools across this country, and the Marxist left is fighting like hell to keep it there when parents ask for it to be removed. It shows one young person of ambiguous gender wearing a strap-on dildo, and another one fellating it on another scene. It has another scene where one of the children asks the other, have you ever tasted your vagina slime? This is in the book for children. It is a graphic novel with drawings of every single bit of this stuff. And the left, Marxist left, let's be clear, is fighting like hell to keep this in the schools. Why? Because it destabilizes the identity and allows the severing of one generation from its previous culture. One generation from the next. So what are you going to do about this? Well, the first thing I want to tell you is that you have to do something. You cannot sit this out. This will not blow over. When George Floyd died and all this stuff blew up, I was on Twitter getting called crazy because I was like, it's not going to blow over. It's not going to blow over. It's not going to blow over. This will not go away on its own. Marxists do not stop when they spring the trap. The Cultural Revolution began in the summer of 2020. It does not stop on its own. You have to do something. So what do you do? Well, it depends on who you are. It depends on what you want to do. If you're an academic, I know there's some in this room, you can study the theory and speak up about it. You can write about it. Yeah, you're risking your career. Your tenure isn't going to mean too much. Isn't that funny? It's the whole point of tenure. But you can study the theory and speak up. Not everybody can. Not everybody should. You can run for school board. You can show up to school board meetings. You can support people who show up to school board meetings. You can get your kids out of the public school, which is ideologically on fire right now. Maybe, I mean, think about it. The school building was actually on fire. You're not going to sit there and say, well, maybe we should put the fire out. Maybe we can get the fire department one day. Maybe we'll give. No, you're going to get your damn kid out of the school. And then you're going to figure out how to put the fire out and rebuild the building. You can create networks in your neighborhoods to get the kids playing together again, get parents talking to one another again. You can let people know that you doubt this, or that you know what it is, that it's Marxism, and you're not going to have it in this country. There are lots of things you can do. I talked to a guy in Wisconsin, which is a wonderful state, by the way. I talked to a guy in Wisconsin, and I got going, and it was one of these kind of things, and I got talking to him over off to the side beforehand, and I started going into all this theory, and he's like, let me stop you. I was like, what, man? He said, I don't have the slightest idea what you're saying. I don't understand the word you're talking about. And I was like, well, I thought you were like involved in this organization. He was like, I am. These guys need somebody to run errands so they can do what they do. So I pick people up from the airport. I go to Staples and get binders and stuff. I don't have the slightest idea about any of this. I can't keep up with it. So theory for you, let me support you. You can be that guy. You can do bake sales to raise money for things. Whatever your skills are. I talked to this pastor, he said you got to find your gifts of the Spirit, and you have to dip into those, but everybody has to play a part. You have to think about it. What can you do? How do you stand up to do something about this? The question is, for you, what is it that you can do to help? The question in the bigger general sense is, how important is it to you to rescue this country and protect the future generation that's going to be destroyed by it? You have to ask yourself that. I don't know what action is correct for any given person, but I do know to tell you that it will not stop on its own, so it has to be done. It has to be stopped, and it can be stopped. The way it's stopped is very simple. You have people who have these ideas, who hold positions of power that they are by definition abusing. Removing somebody from a position of power that they're abusing is not canceling somebody. That is not cancel culture. That's taking responsibility, especially when it comes to protecting children, especially from sexual degeneracy. And if you want to know, by the way, where did all this sexual degeneracy come from? George Lukács. It's not new. It didn't just come out of the ground with Judith Butler in the 1990s. It didn't come out of the ground on Tumblr in 2014 with your poor kids going on the internet and getting groomed into anorexia and suicide and being trans. George Lukács, in 1919, became the Deputy Commissar of Education for the Hungarian communist regime that took over for a few months before the Hungarians were like, hell no, and beat these people out of power. And what did he institute? Rampant sexual liberation education, teaching kids to masturbate, teaching kids about sexual pleasure. I just saw a thing that came out the other day that there's this push within comprehensive sex education under all these banners in some states right now, trying to teach children that sexual pleasure raises your grades. Why? Because people like George Lukács understood that if you can destabilize the children and make them into sexual degenerates and reprobates, then they will throw off their old culture that tries to suppress them from that. That's exactly why. This is a communist plot 100 years long that's finally coming to fruit. So you have to take the people pushing this stuff out of power. That's the only answer. They will not stop on their own. It's the only thing you can do. How do you do that? Legislative action. That's one thing. For example, you can create a bill that might challenge this stuff. If you are an everyday person, you can support that bill by testifying to the legislature, by writing letters to your governors, to sign the bill when it actually passes the House. Mr. Sununu. I wrote a letter to him, by the way. I wrote a letter. I testified in the New Hampshire Legislative Committee, and I wrote a letter to the governor. It didn't work. I tried. But you can do that. What do those bills contain? Teeth. They ban these divisive concepts, these damaging practices, and then they remove teachers' licenses and fine people who decide to put them into practice in flaunting of the law. You have to remove people from the positions of power that they're abusing. You have to take either your children out from under them or them out of the position to abuse your children. You need to show up and get involved and find out. You need to ask questions. What's in the curriculum? You need to be ready to invite the lawsuit or to file the lawsuit if they're abusing your kids. If they're doing something illegal, if they're violating the Civil Rights Act, for example. We don't even really need new bills technically. They're violating the Civil Rights Act. We need these lawsuits, people to stand up and to take the fight. And it's got to be a total fight at every legal level. And I only stress that just in case there's any feds in the room. Legal. Every legal means. No illegal means. Don't get confused. We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We don't want to make the same mistakes that they made in the 1940s and afterwards and create a fascist solution to an attempted communist problem. We don't want helicopters. If you don't know what that reference is, go look up Pinochet. We don't need that. We need every legal means to remove these people from positions of power that they're abusing. People have to be held accountable for implementing this. They know they're doing it. The state of North Carolina, which I referenced with regard to their social emotional learning programs, actually passed a law in advance of implementing this at the full scale in the North Carolina schools, saying that teachers cannot be held liable for practicing psychology without a license in classrooms on children. Why? Because that's exactly what social emotional learning is. Non-licensed therapy being practiced in unregulated, non-therapeutic spaces on groups of children. People should go to prison for doing this. The North Carolinians, Marxists, realized this and passed a law making sure they wouldn't. So you have to be able to find ways to petition your lawmakers to stand up against this. You have to file lawsuits for yourself to stand up against this. It's the only way. It's the absolute only way. In the meantime, you need to protect your children, and you need to also figure out, like, what are they trying to do? Do the opposite. They want to sever one generation from the next. Mentor some kids. Teach them real values. Get them involved. I'm not even religious. Get them involved in a church. They want to sever the next generation from the values that have made this country work. Teach the kids the Constitution. Teach the kids what it is to be American. Why this American experiment with e pluribus unum is already the best diversity, equity, and inclusion. I hate the word equity, but I'm using their language. Program that's ever been instituted in the world. Teach them this. Teach them honest history about the struggles that Thomas Jefferson had dealing with the fact that he believed all men should be created or were created equal and should be equal, but that he held slaves. Show them the letters Thomas Jefferson wrote struggling with this. Teach them honest history. And since the other side is going to say, we just want to teach honest history, you just want to ban that kind of education, demand curriculum transparency. File Freedom of Information Act requests to find out what's in the curriculum. No more blind eye. Formalize every possible meeting structure you can imagine. They want everything informal. Let's just have a voice vote. No, bring it to the floor every single time. Everything's formal. Get the curriculum out there. Show up to your school board. Read genderqueer. See what happens. They'll turn your microphone off while they fight to keep it in the library for your children. Get familiar with the law. These are the different things you have to do. There is no sitting this out, and there is no simple way. You have to learn that they're manipulating language so you can see through those manipulations and call them out. You have to understand that when they say you're challenging democracy, that communists believe that democracy only exists when everybody's perfectly equal, because otherwise some people have more voice or more resources than others, and so it's not a true democracy. So when they say this threatens our democracy, you should realize what they mean is a democracy in the future that's under a communist rule. You have to be able to call these things out. You're going to have to read some of it. I recommend everybody go read Critical Race Theory and Introduction, which I read from. It's not hard. It's at the high school level. It's 190 pages. You can read it in about 5 hours. You should go read it, their words for yourself. You'll see on page 23. I read the thing about the liberal order. See on page 23 where they say that critical race theorists are highly suspicious of another liberal mainstay, namely rights. And then you need to go fight for things like rights, because the critical race theorists don't want that. Go read some queer theory, see how crazy it is, see what they want to do. Find out that in fact it's not about marriage equality. They say in their own words that marriage equality would do what? Stabilize and normalize LGBTQ identities, so you can't have that. And so you can then articulate, no, queer theory is not about creating stable LGBTQ identities. Here it is in Hannah Dyer's own words that it's the opposite of that. She goes on in that paper, by the way, to say that early childhood education needs to be rethought entirely to destroy childhood innocence, which is a narrative created by the ideologists in power, so that children will not be brought up into sexual identities. You need to be able to show up and give citations. The one rule if you show up at a legislative meeting or if you write a letter is that you must show, not tell. You must show. Nobody will believe you. That's why I read straight from their things in front and say that I want to be representative of their stuff fairly bullcrap. You have to see it for yourself. You won't believe it's there. You'll think I'm making it up. You have to show, not tell. So show up and do that. These things can work, but you actually have to get involved. The easiest thing you can do if you look at all of this and you think, I don't want to do any of that, I'm not about to ask you for money, but that is something you can do. You don't have to give it to me. There are other people doing things too. The easiest thing you can do is actually make it known to other people that you are somebody they can talk to. So the last thing I'll tell you about, a little story. My daughter's friend came over and was talking to us one day, and she was really stressed out. And she said, can I confess something to you? And I was like, sure. And she's like, gets all worked up, it takes her a minute, and she says, I'm done with the pronouns. I can't do the pronouns anymore. And then she starts crying. And I'm like, damn it, I don't want to deal with this. Oh my God. But she's crying, she says, because she's never been able to say that to somebody. I hear this all over the place. Everywhere I go, people think they're the only one. They think if they say anything, they're going to offend somebody, or they're going to hurt somebody's feelings, or something bad is going to happen, and everybody thinks it and nobody can say it. Let somebody know that you're somebody that they can say it to. Be a safe space. Do you not understand that what they call safe spaces are an inversion of the real thing? Of course they are. Everything's an inversion. So be that person for somebody, or for several people. Start getting organized. As people come together and they start to speak up, you can start to get together, get informed, read these things together, share information, share what's going on in schools, show what you dug up at your kid's school or whatever it happens to be, and then start, when you are informed and you have a number of people, start to get organized. Take organized action, show up in droves. In Utah, they have a thing called Utah Parents United that in under 6 months raised up over 30,000 members. I think they're close to 50,000 members now. Thousands of parents and grandparents show up to county commission meetings, city council meetings, school board meetings, etc. when they put something controversial like this crazy gender thing they just put on their agenda. And all of a sudden they're rethinking it. There's a big win in Utah. A lot of people don't know about what they put out, some weird gender thing in the law. Parents all over the country actually started writing into the Utah state legislature. Parents all over Utah with Utah Parents United started showing up in person, and they actually decided they needed to rethink that thing when thousands of people showed up angry saying this is a terrible idea. It actually works. So get organized, get together, stop being afraid, start sharing information, and then show up and take action in coordinated, strategic ways, and we actually can push this thing back. The word of hope, it's as bad as all this sounds, the word of hope is we've been pushing back for a year and we've undone most of a century of their planning. They're scrambling. They're having to tell the most outrageous and ridiculous lies to try to paper over what they're doing. Most of those have to do with the vaccines and COVID, but they're telling crazy ones about critical race theory as well. They're just trying to teach honest history. Everybody that I've seen in like every state just makes fun of this now. It's just preposterous. Everybody knows it's a lie. The vaccine stuff's really great. Did you know I saw that eating meat and also breathing too much can cause heart attacks and myocarditis? Totally ridiculous. So 1 year, 1.5 years maybe, of actual pushback, of people becoming informed about this issue and starting to take action in whatever walks of life they have. We pushed back nearly a century of activism to undermine this country. Time for you to pick up your share of this job and do it. We can win this. It's not actually going to be that hard. These people have a preposterously paper-thin theory, and if you get informed on what it really is, show that it's Marxism and get people involved, we can push it out of our schools, we can push it out of our society, and we can punish companies that are trying to do it through some kind of weird social credit system that they're cooking up with World Economic Forum. So that's your job. Thank you for having me. Again, I'm glad to be in New England.
Great talk, amazing speech. Thank you again to everyone for coming out. We're going to have a little bit of dessert here for a few minutes as well, so that will be amazing, like all the other food we had tonight. And then just as well, while the servers are going around, just tell them thank you for helping out so much with this venue. And I'm not sure if Rao's around, the owner, but I definitely want to give him a round of applause as well. We want to give him a round of applause. Yeah, so just say we're going to have a little bit of dessert here, so we'll just stick around for a few more minutes, and then Dr. Lindsay, I'm sure you would love to answer some questions too from some people. So,
Sure.
Yeah.
Cool. Awesome.
We can go straight to it.
I'll kick off with a question. So it's not just critical race theory, right? Our economy is being entwined with these communist thought processes. Clearly, social media is a key factor in some of the means and mechanisms through which they're accomplishing these things. Our politics is deeply corrupted by external forces, right? We've got literal communists, in major interventions in our domestic affairs, right? So we're not independent of self-determining anymore in the traditional sense that we used to be. So it's a big unraveling that we've got going. I wonder if you can comment, right? COVID is another big factor here that seems to be a big agitator in terms of mixing people up, etc.
Yeah, all these things are the same thing.
Yeah.
You really want to think of it as, I hate to draw a weird mythological analogy, but you really want to think of it like a hydra with a whole bunch of heads. It's like a dragon with like 10 heads. They all have the same body. And so, yes, COVID is the same thing. They created a pair of identity categories, vaccinated and unvaccinated. The correct terminology for both is person, by the way. The stuff with the economy is actually wrapped straight into this. As a matter of fact, what the goal is with all of this, including critical race theory, just to give you a picture of what it works like, it is two things at once that I'm going to mix my metaphors up a little bit here. But on the one hand, it's a lockpick, because race has been so sensitive in this country. It works extremely well. It also creates those conditions where you can create black identities and push people into red identities. In other words, to become allies, political black, or whatever the word happens to be. As Ayanna Pressley put it, we don't want any more brown faces and black faces. We don't want any brown voices and black voices. I didn't quite get her quote exactly right, but you get the idea. That's straight out of critical race theory's idea of structural determinism creating a unique voice of color. You can read that in Delgado, actually, the high school book. So the goal is to actually pick the lock with critical race theories, to pick the lock to open Western civilization to communist revolution. It's also, if you will, says where the metaphors get mixed up, the paving stones for the new plan. And so what the new plan involves actually is three primary dimensions of control that there's already a corporate social credit system involved that is what's going to be used to introject this new morality. Everybody has to participate in it. That's corporate social credit system follows by the three letters ESG, which stand for Environmental, Social, and Governance Standards. That's part of the so-called Sustainable Development Goals that the UN puts out. The goal with ESG is to give people environmental policy, social justice policy, and best practices in governance policy that they have to adhere to. The way that it's being affected is the big banks are saying if you want your assets managed, if you want investment money, etc., then you have to have a certain level of ESG score in your company. I just saw an article and shared it yesterday that an investment magazine published pointing out that the goal is now going to bring this to individuals, especially as we move into central bank digital currencies. So the idea is that you're going to have not Bitcoin, but some Federal Reserve cryptocurrency that is completely hooked up to a social credit system, so that if you want to have a high enough score to buy a plane ticket or whatever else, you've got to be environmentally conscious, you've got to do whatever the governance rules are, which probably means watching Obama propaganda videos or something. I mean, not really Obama, but maybe. That's what they actually do in China. They make people watch like Xi Jinping propaganda videos, CCP propaganda videos, to be able to buy Starbucks or whatever this today. They can freeze your account or whatever if you don't participate. And then you also will have to, kind of positively affirm social justice initiatives and so on according to what they want under the S score. So ES&G is going to be the name, or ESG generally is going to be the name of how they blend all of these things into a total social control mechanism through which these unaccountable technocrats in mostly Davos are going to be able to organize everybody's life down to the finest detail. If you want to know what it looks like, China is operating the current stage 1 out of several progression into this total control environment with their social credit system and all the other means of surveillance, etc., that they're using. The goal is actually to cause the West overall, to reproduce the Chinese model in order to compete with it. You'll hear our leaders talking about that all the time. We have to become China to outcompete China. They have all these advantages with their autocratic system. They try to use COVID-19 as an excuse for doing that. You say, look how great China did by welding people into their homes. By the way, they just lied about the numbers. They didn't do that great either with the virus. If we want to get really deep, it's totally a huge communist religious program. The goal is to create a fascist system with a communist redistribution scheme inside of it to compete with China's communist system with a fascist market within it. And when you put those two things, if you understand Marxism, I know this is high level and I mostly got normal people here, but that's two dialectical opposites that are going to be placed in opposition. They're not going to be enemies, they're going to be frenemies, and it's going to oatmeal out into global communism under sustainability and a so-called circular economy, where, what does a circular economy mean? Circular economy means that which goes out goes back in, and that's the nature of the economy. So there is no actual production. There is the outputs of the economy become the inputs again, or in the words of the World Economic Forum, you will own nothing and be happy. Everything that you have, you will rent, and Western values will have been pushed beyond their breaking point. That was from their 2016 propaganda video they thought was a good idea to release. This is why I'm telling you we can win. They're stupid that they put this out. They're literally telling you that they want you to own nothing and be happy. But it's all connected. And so the way that you resist that is you don't participate. You just, then they did not expect people to know what critical race theory was until they got much further along. They did not expect people to realize that social emotional learning is actually a terrible thing that's manipulating children. They expected people to just get the vaccine and then go ahead and get a passport and sign up for a digital ID, and everything was just going to truck along, and then they're going to shift over to climate change. So far, none of this has actually worked out too well. Do not go along with whatever these big weirdo plans are, and they can't just implement them, and they increasingly have to become absurd or use force or lie in more and more transparent ways, and eventually they're going to be removed from power. Hopefully, again, by totally legal means, one after another. There are a lot of people, I would guess right now, based on the way that they've changed the rhetoric around masks and the vaccines and so on, there are a lot of people right now who have suspected that the Democrats have figured out that something bad is going to happen to their party in November, more than likely, and then lots of them might end up in jail once there's a handover of power, and I think that that should happen. So the way that you resist it, though, is don't participate. You know, get in your semi and blow the horn. It works, apparently.
I was just, you brought up fascism, and because these billionaires with their private-public
Public-private partnership.
exactly. So it seems to me that the anti-fascists are the fascists, and even communist China, as you say, has a fascist model. That what they're showing is that fascism, that they have to rely on fascism to actually produce goods.
Yeah, that's the thing. There's a couple of things I can say about that. You know, one's deeper and more theoretical, and one's kind of more superficial. The Marxists have always lied about how socialism was going to actually work, and then they say when it fails that it didn't actually get tried because what happened was state capitalism emerged. But state capitalism is socialism. Fascism is step one of the communist program. It's actually built in there. The only difference is that they don't center the corporations. They make the state the main corporation. People, in fact, a Marxist tried to argue with me about this the other day on the internet, and I didn't have the brilliance to give this reply. And he said, "Ha ha ha! There were no." He said, "Ha ha ha! There were no corporations in the Soviet Union." And somebody very brilliantly replied, "The USSR was the corporation." And that's how it actually works. That's exactly what's going on in China. So that's the superficial level, is that they actually have to implement. How are they going to have a dictatorship that redistributes everything if they don't own all the means of production, which is fascism? That is your public-private partnership in the modern parlance, run by stakeholders who used to be called the party. What's the deeper answer to this? Well, if we look at the theory, you know, I keep going back. The Marxists in the 1960s kind of laid all of this out. And what they actually, if you read Herbert Marcuse's 69 essay on liberation that I keep bringing up, it's such a key document to what we live in right now. If you actually read that document, he says very explicitly that the problem in the Soviet state is that it can't solve the production problem. The only reason socialism's not working and becomes so bureaucratic and terrible, he says, is because it can't get production levels up to what capitalism can produce. Capitalism, he recognized, delivers the goods. But the problem is that they have the wrong ideology. They don't have the Soviet ideology. So he says the Soviets are actually ahead in this game, but that until they can solve the production problem, they can't get there. So what happened was, a man by the name of Henry Kissinger, fun name to drop, helped China, namely through Deng Xiaoping, figure out the solution to this problem, which was to dialectically incorporate fascism, a fascist market, explicitly inside of the communist state. So Kissinger built the monster that we have to become in order to defeat it, because he probably was a Marxist that wanted us to become the monster. 2, global communism, global one thing. So this turns out to be theoretically what's going on, is that they're trying to solve the production problem. They believe that with AI they can do the distribution problem that von Mises pointed out, for example. But they have to solve the production problem. How do you get enough innovation? How do you get enough production? And the way that you're going to do that is by incorporating a fascist market with corporations that stand to become mega rich, and encouraging them, for example, like Amazon, to deliver goods by drone or whatever other cool innovations allow for all this to go. So that's actually what's kind of unfolding right now. They think that they've achieved the technological levels. If you read that essay on liberation, he says it. They think that they've achieved the levels of production and technology necessary to solve the production problem while having a socialist ideology operating in terms of how things go. And then they're trying out two forms of that in the world, China representing one and the West being made of the other. A different way to phrase that, by the way, is that East Asia already exists, and we need to make Oceania so it can always have been at war with it. If you've read your George Orwell, you know what I'm talking about. Another essay from Marcuse in '65 points out this fascist element as well. If you've read Repressive Tolerance, you know it's one of the most fascistic documents in the universe. He basically says, in fact, he doesn't basically say, he literally says that the point of a liberating or democratic tolerance should, or liberating tolerance as opposed to democratic tolerance, he says, should be that movements from the left are tolerated even when they're violent. Movements from the right shall not be tolerated, even to the point of preventing the idea from entering the mind of a potential reactionary. So in other words, you have to engage, he says in his own words, censorship and pre-censorship. But he says because in the post-fascist era we live in a state of clear and present danger constantly of dipping into a fascist totalitarianism, that it's justified, because Marcuse's false choice is that we either are going to have communism or we're going to have Nazis. And there's no possible other devolution of capitalism. So he advocates explicitly for a left-leaning fascist state in order to gain complete revolutionary objective, or achieve a complete revolutionary objective while suppressing any possible counter-revolutionary activity. Meanwhile, that's going to, enable technology to allow us to solve the production problem. By the way, also in his book, One Dimensional Man from '64, points out that the main problem with capitalism is in fact that it's not sustainable. And so it has to enter into a sustainable capitalist phase. And he also says near the end of the book that that will presuppose a dramatic reduction in the world population, which was 3.9 billion in 1964 when he wrote that, roughly half of what it is now. So you can kind of see all these programs tie back to Herbert Marcuse, the leading Marxist thinker of the 1960s, that have all been enacted piece by piece by piece, from critical race theory to the ESG metrics to the COVID nonsense. All of it's there with the agenda of creating a sustainable circular economy that solves the production problem by making sure that nobody owns anything and everybody shares everything, and you will be happy. Sir.
So we have a situation in this community where we have equity committees. They are studying DEI and making recommendations to change the hiring practices, to change the curriculum, change the way that the administrative people are schooled. They're giving classes. You'll never hear anything about CRT. Never. They don't acknowledge that they're teaching it. They don't acknowledge that it's part of what's going on. And I'm just wondering how we create the nexus to show that they are guilty of the charge.
Okay, so in case you couldn't hear, the question was, you never hear CRT. You have equity committees that push DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. You'll hear in the educational space something about, culturally responsive teaching or culturally relevant teaching or something like this, but you will never hear them actually invoke CRT or critical race theory. Culturally relevant teaching turns out to be CRT also. And so the question was, how do you nail the jello to the wall and get it to be revealed that this is in fact what they're doing? And this is where I go back to show, don't tell. You actually have to show up and you have to point out, for example, some people, not everybody's going to get this articulate on it, but some of you have to get articulate and show up. You have to learn enough of the words to be able to point out that if you're talking about equity, you're talking about socialism. If you're talking about diversity, how is diversity going to be defined? That diversity is going to be defined in terms of having the particular identity consciousness, race consciousness, or whatever, to speak from that unique voice of color. All you actually have to do is read their book and parrot their words a little bit back at them. It's not as hard as it sounds. But what you have to be able to do is to point out that when they talk about privilege. What do they mean by that? You have to explain. Well, what privilege actually means is access to the upper caste of society versus being excluded from the upper caste of society. And so when you're talking about these different ideas, you actually are going to have to go on to show them these words mean what you say they mean in a Marxist context. And the only way that it's ever going to be believed, I'm telling you from now 2 or 3 years of painful experience, is by reading it from their own sources in front of people who are therefore stuck having to understand what it is. It's the only way. But it helps, frankly, to point out that they will do these manipulations, that they will choose other language to avoid naming what it is. As far as CRT that goes, though, I would also recommend using not their language. So my friend Chris Rufo, who you may have heard of, is a very effective activist, especially with regard to the legislative pushes against this stuff, says to use the phrase state-sanctioned racism, and then say we're not going to do state-sanctioned racism. If you look at the bills that have been put forth, or when Trump wrote his executive order banning critical race theory, it doesn't ban critical race theory, as a matter of fact. It bans discrimination, scapegoating, and stereotyping by sex and race. It bans claiming that the United States is an intrinsically evil, racist, sexist country. It bans very specific practices like racial caucus, that this bill doesn't, but the bills can ban very specific practices like racial caucusing, which is a fancy word for segregating by race. And so by banning things like segregating by race very explicitly, which has already got massive precedent in the United States, and it's consistent with the 14th Amendment and such like that, by banning curriculum that racially scapegoats stereotypes, etc., and then setting up commissions that are going to be equipped to be able to identify when that's occurring, and with people being able to submit materials, you can actually start to nail this jello to the wall. But it does take a lot of patience and a lot of persistence, because the Marxist agenda is always to redefine words so that they can lie without anybody realizing they're lying. And it's not easy. So it takes, if you're a Christian audience, I'd say you need discernment. You need to pray for discernment and use your discernment. But I can only do that in church. So that's what it actually comes down to. The way you obtain that discernment, if you're the one that's going to speak up about it, and maybe it's not you, maybe you're supporting people who are, but if you're going to speak up about it, is that you read their materials and you listen. I mean, you can go listen to my podcasts, they're all free, or you can go read other people's materials or whatever. You have to, there is no easy way. You actually have to learn some of this garbage, which sounds miserable and like you have better things to do, and I know you have better things to do, except no you don't, because you don't have anything better to do than save this country. You literally don't, because we lose everything if this falls. So there's not an easy answer for you. To consistently learn enough, when they bring up DEI, you should have, if you're going to show up, you have a talking point about why DEI is the same thing, and you can bring from their literature. If they bring up culturally responsive teaching, you point out that the first paper from, and again, I've got a podcast about this, so you can learn it from that or whatever. This is where I said, get organized and then get informed. So the first paper from culturally responsive teaching says that the point of culturally responsive teaching is to create academic excellence, to induce cultural competence, never actually says what that means, and to raise a critical consciousness. It says that. So when they say it says to raise a critical consciousness is the point of culturally responsive teaching, they invoke that word. You say, why did Gloria Ladson-Billings in 1995 in her paper Toward a Theory of Culturally Responsive Pedagogy say that the point of a culturally responsive teaching is to raise a critical consciousness, when raising critical consciousness is a directly Marxist idea? If it's not, why did she say that if it's not Marxism? And the answer, of course, is there it is in black and white. That's the point of it. And it turns out that the only way that you can do this is to actually have these talking points prepared, show up and deliver them in front of audiences who will then be aghast and appalled. Or just look up their definition of race on the Brandeis University Social Justice website and read that everywhere you go, because it's horrifying and people's jaws literally drop. That's the only way. You have to learn their tricks. There's a book called Political Ponerology that was written by a Polish psychologist. Ponerology means study of evil, from the Greek poneros. And this guy survived communism. He wrote this book about it, and he says the only way to push this back is to devise a language that uncovers their false language. They always use an abusive language to abuse power. And so the only way to do it, and I mean it, is that you have to get informed enough and have these key talking points. And it sounds like an impossible task on the front end, but I'm telling you, this thing is as wide as Lake Superior, but it's an inch deep. It's really not that hard to just have talking points about every single point they might raise, but somebody has to do their homework. Yes, sir.
CRT says that they want to abolish whiteness. How do they actually envision that? Like, make every white person feel guilty? Or
They say that they don't want to induce guilt and shame, but that, yes. So to abolish whiteness is to make...
Kill all the people.
It's to make white people feel as though they have to renounce the benefits that they get from the existence of a system that includes whiteness as a form of racial property. That's a very abstract answer. The practical answer is by inducing guilt and shame, even though they say repeatedly that the goal is not to induce guilt and shame. They have no answer for how to deal with the fact that it always induces guilt and shame, especially in children. Turns out it's a really powerful tool to use against it, because it always induces this. So, in practice, if we were a Christian, I would say judge them by their fruits. In practice, what happens is that you end up with, say it's at a school board meeting, you have children saying, I'm the worst kind of person. What do you mean by that, buddy? I'm white skin, my people are terrible people. And the guilt and shame become really palpable. And so you can actually throw it back on them. How are you going to do this without inducing this guilt and shame, where it induces guilt and shame everywhere it's gone? The best thing to do, though, again, is going, how to answer your question and wait for the train.
That's for you.
Honk. Honk.
That was planned and it's
Honk. That's the sound of freedom, folks. But the answer is yes, they are inducing guilt and shame in association with it. It scapegoats whiteness. It doesn't necessarily attack or scapegoat white people, but white people happen to have access to whiteness, so then they do scapegoat white people by proxy. What you can actually do, though, is find people who will give testimony, if you want to challenge this, about what happened when racial diversity programs got brought into their school or got brought into their workplace. You can find these horror stories where they take like the poor black guy at the workplace and they make him sit in the middle of a room and have everybody in the room go around and confess how they were racist and how they actually have racist ideas, and like nobody wants to be the person who doesn't have anything to say, so like everybody's like, oh I secretly think your people are stupid. And what happens? The most dysfunctional workplace environment, hostile working environment you can imagine. And if you think it's bad with that race example, you should hear the stuff they do when they find out that somebody's gay. Like everybody asking for months, how do you people have sex at work? And so the examples now, to get people really should be collecting testimony of just what an utter catastrophe this is. And then state attorneys general can sue the living crap out of these people for selling a fraudulent product, because it does not produce the results it claims to produce. There's no evidence supporting that it does, and ample evidence now that it produces the opposite. And so millions of dollars of taxpayer money and private money are being dumped into a fraudulent product, and consumer protection laws, someday some attorneys general will stand up for this. So you can write your attorney general and tell him that in whichever of the two states you're in. I've talked to Ken Paxson in Texas about it like 5 times, so don't hold your breath. Let me grab her.
Well, first of all, it was brilliant, and thank you for refreshing my course on Marxism, which I learned back in Ukraine. Now I'm up to speed again. It's all about power, ultimately, and also it's important to know, as we say, know your enemy in their face. And I was reading a lot about the Great Reset theory and Schwab's book back in 1973. There must be some kind of marriage between critical and race theory and this Great Reset, which right now the COVID makes our all in mass plankton. And I wonder, what are your comments concerning the marriage of these two?
Yeah, so if you didn't hear, so the question is, what's the connection between critical race theory and the Great Reset? If you don't know what the Great Reset is a narrow window of opportunity to change the entire world economy using COVID-19 as a pretext, according to the World Economic Forum CEO Klaus Schwab, whose accent I badly imitated. He's a perfect Bond villain. If you don't know what he looks like, you should look him up. It actually looks like that character from Dr. Evil from the Mike Myers movies back in the day, except older and wearing a spacesuit. He's a very strange man. So anyway, the Great Reset is actually the name for the program to shift us from the old model to this new circular public-private partnership model, or whatever, that's controlled by these ESG metrics and so on. The relationship to critical race theory turns out to be in the social dimension of that model. So the new model, the new economy, is all going to be based off of, after the Great Reset, which is just this program to introduce a new economic model across the world. Everything's going to be monitored. Everything's going, like all your transactions, it's ideally all going to be digital currency so they can track every single thing. There was actually, what's his name? Antonin something or another is like the comptroller for one of these major world banks in Europe, came out the other day. There was a video I shared on the internet that where he's speaking. He says if somebody spends $100 today, a $100 bill, we don't know how to track them, we don't know what they spent it on, but when we get to these digital currencies, we will know what they spent it on, and we'll be able to track every single purchase, and we'll be able to tie it to your social credit score and decide, you know, perhaps if you look at China, whether you're qualified to use your money today or this month. Maybe you can or cannot buy groceries, maybe you can or cannot buy a flight, maybe you are not allowed to buy a first-class flight if you want one, if you can afford that. Maybe you can't buy alcohol this week. Certainly enjoy trying to buy guns or ammo. Explicitly, they say that will impact your social credit score negatively, and those around you who do business with you, social credit score will be impacted negatively. And so their goal is to implement critical race theory as the racial dimension of the racial equity program within the new economy produced by the Great Reset, which is a lot of words. If you doubt this, you should just go to the World Economic Forum website, which you can do, weforum.org. You can go to their website and type in critical race theory in the search, and you'll see, or intersectionality, which is a concept within critical race theory. You'll see they have hundreds of articles supporting this. They just put out a propaganda video yesterday or the day before yesterday saying what is critical race theory and why is it so important. So the World Economic Forum and the Great Reset and Klaus Schwab are all in. It's like I said earlier, it is the paving stone. It is the moral justification that they're going to use to introduce an ESG score with a social justice component to it. Don't you want to be racially just? Well, if you don't, you must want to be a racist. So you must have this new credit score, not that says how good of a borrower or a lender you are, but know how you socially behave. And this new social credit score is going to determine, you know, the limits on what you can do to participate in the economy. And I've said that, you know, use your money for this, get on a train for that, go on a plane. That's stuff they're doing in China now. Later down the track, it will be, are you allowed to go, just like we saw in COVID, more than 5 kilometers from your house? Are you allowed to, I know we're in America, nobody knows what a kilometer is, but are you allowed to go more than 3.1 miles away from your house? Are you allowed to go more than, sorry, I'm going to do it in metric, 800 meters from your house, 200 meters from your house. So in Australia during the pandemic, I have a friend who actually lived in Melbourne, which had the worst lockdowns in the world, maybe outside of China, and he said, you know, 3 out of 5 days when he went to check the mail, a police officer would show up and ask him why he was outside of his house. And he'd say, I'm getting the mail. And they'd say, okay, and go away. Eventually this will be, of course, done, the tracking will be done by drone and facial recognition cameras attached to the drones. And so if you don't have authorization to be further away than a few hundred feet from your front door, then you won't be allowed to, and you'll be massively, heavily fined or locked out of your bank account, or have your bank account seized or something like that, whatever level of control they actually want to. The gulag will not be a physical place after the Great Reset. It will be a digital place. You will have to stay in your house and watch all the propaganda videos and go positively affirm the right values on social media if you want to unlock your bank account so that you can order your groceries to be delivered by Amazon or something like that after you're a good citizen again. Because the point of the gulag was not a concentration camp, it was a re-education camp. Gulag was not Hitler. It was a different program. The Gulag was to re-educate people and to punish people who were deemed unable to be re-educated. Your re-education is going to come through relentless propaganda through your devices and through using your social credit score to absolutely control you and fine your bank account into zero if they don't want you to move around. It's really potentially scary, which is again why we must take action. And I know nobody in this room can take this action specifically, but we need, for example, bills banning individual social credit scores, maybe even a constitutional amendment banning such a thing. And state level's great, but I mean, we need this at the federal level. And seriously, data protection constitutional amendment or data privacy, constitutional amendments are things that we need to be thinking about ahead of time right now to prevent those kinds of things. So the way that critical race theory works out is it's going to be the stupid justification and the program upon which it's going to be based so that everything gets made equitable. Why do they want equity, by the way? Partly because they're communists and they just believe in redistribution theory, but more importantly because what they're looking for is a completely stable economy that has no boom and bust cycles, it has no major conflict. If you can cause conflict between two different groups, that causes instability. That instability might threaten the social order that they have their thumb on. And so they want everything to be, I use the phrase oatmeal all the time, they want everything averaged out to oatmeal so that there's nobody getting mad, nobody doing anything, nobody making too much money, nobody losing too much money, no banks ever going bust. They want everything to be a perfectly predictable, controlled economy, including by controlling your behavior down to the finest minutia. But if there's any inequity, they think that that'll be a source of conflict in the redistributive world order, so they have to make a completely equitable system where that conflict is unlikely to arise. So that's the role critical race theory plays within the Great Reset, is absolutely central. As a matter of fact, if critical race theory is completely exposed and broken, the Great Reset's probably not going to work. It's strong enough where that's probably the case.
Thank you. And this will probably be the last question. Jim.
Really briefly, thank you, Dr. Lindsay, for your lecture. It was very edifying. And thank you to Republicans. You mentioned ESG scores. I just want to get a plug in. We can only do things at the state level. In the state of New Hampshire, there's a bill currently in the legislature that would ban effectively ESG scores. It's House Bill 1469, and the prime sponsor is J.D. Bernardi. And it's likely going to pass the House, but the banking industry is going to try to kill it in the Senate. So we might need some help getting it through the Senate. It is only at the state level, but at least it's a start. House Bill 1469.
So if you couldn't hear him, he said the House Bill 1469 here in the great state, or in Vermont, the great state of New Hampshire over there. Whichever way it is. The great state of New Hampshire, which is a stone's throw away, has House Bill 1469 that is going to prohibit ESG in that fantastic live free or die state. And so what he said is it is very likely to pass the House, but it is going to be challenged especially by bank money influences at the Senate. And so anything you can do to, whether it's writing letters, whether it's testifying, whatever, if you're informed, don't testify if you're ignorant, to try to support that bill to make sure that this passes. Creating islands, certain states that resist these things, Florida, of course, is a great example with what they did with COVID, really messes up their plans. The idea is that it has to happen everywhere at once or else it's going to fall apart, because what will happen is if ESG is non-competitive, yes it is, they're lying when they say that it's better. If ESG is non-competitive and a state like New Hampshire prohibits ESG, people will come to New Hampshire in order to live outside of ESG, and they will outcompete. And then it'll be the same thing that happened when Florida did its stuff with COVID. And Florida obviously was doing better than most of the nation, especially economically. And what's happened to Florida's population and what's happened, everybody's going to Florida all the time. People are fleeing states like New York and California. And the thing is that's the kind of data that they can't hide. And so when that happens, you actually get massive amounts, much more than it sounds like. Oh, just a little state of New Hampshire. Any island of resistance creates conditions under which the data appears that leads to more islands of resistance. So if you can, was it 1469, House Bill 1469, try to write to the New Hampshire state legislature, both House to support it and Senate, to make sure that they try to do the right thing. I don't know what you do about your governor, good luck. These kinds of things need to happen. So I know we're in like the People's Republic of Vermont right now, so it's probably not going to happen here. But agitate for that here too. You might be surprised. At least getting the debate on the floor is a problem for them. They want all this stuff to happen quietly, behind closed doors, under the radar. I could give you a million examples where they slide some huge policy change in some organization in like the night before. Best example, Evergreen State College, which everybody I think has heard of now, had a social justice meltdown a few years ago following the adoption of their equity plan. They literally programmed the equity plan the night before. They sent it out to the faculty it was to be voted on in the faculty meeting the next morning. They sent it out at like 10 p.m. the night before with a broken link so nobody could actually read it. And the idea being that nobody would show up to oppose it if they didn't know what was in it. They pull these kinds of tricks. I could give you like 30 examples of them pulling these kinds of tricks in major institutional settings successfully. Southern Baptist Convention did the same thing with Resolution 9, which explicitly brought critical race theory and intersectionality in subordinate to scripture into the Southern Baptist Convention. Can you think of something more conservative? In 2019. How did they do it? Same trick. 13 resolutions on the floor. They ran out of time on Resolution 8. We're just going to blow a vote on 9 through 13 as a block. No time for discussion. Go. And so all four or whatever those resolutions were to be voted on in a single, if you wanted 3 of them, you have to vote for all of them. And it was the super controversial one where they suddenly ran out of time. They do this all the time. They know what they're doing. It's a strategy. So you definitely want to support anything that throws a monkey wrench in their plans. And so get informed, show up, support these things. Very important. Thank you for making sure that we found out about that tonight.
Thanks again for coming. We really appreciate kind of the big turnout. You want to add anything, Blake?
Yes, all of our events are free and open to the public, and if you'd like to be on my email list and you're not already to get updates about the club and to be invited to future events, please come and see me and add your name to my notebook. Thanks so much, guys.
Croc TV.